Hello, my name is Medella Bear, and thank you for joining me on today's episode of Little Known History. The deaf community is a marginalized cultural and linguistic group that is often forgotten when discussing societal issues. Like any other oppressed group, the deaf community has faced many challenges and harsh discrimination throughout history. Today, I will be discussing the birth of education for deaf people in Europe and America and its history. Historically, Europe did not attempt to educate their deaf population, deeming them unable to learn. However, a gradual change towards educating the deaf population began in the early 1500s. To start, I will discuss Girolamo Cardano. Cardano was an Italian mathematician and physician who birthed a deaf son, whose name is still unknown. Previous scholar Aristotle deemed the deaf unable to learn, claiming that this ability was linked directly to the ability to speak. Cardano was one of the first to challenge this belief. He developed his own signed code to teach his son to read and write. Around the same time, a Spanish monk named Pedro Ponce de Leon started educating his own deaf students. While he focused more on what is modernly known as oralism, it is indicated in writings of Friar Juan de Pablo Bonet that Leon developed a manual signed alphabet. Both Cardano and Leon inspired our previously mentioned Juan Pablo Bonet to educate the deaf through signs. In 1620, Bonet, a Spanish monk who had been educating his own deaf students, published the first book related to educating the deaf. Its English translation is Reduction of Letters and Art for Teaching Mute People to Speak. It emphasized using what is now called fingerspelling to create sounds. While it focused more on oralism, it was a crucial step for educating the deaf through signed languages. Bonnet's publication increased Europe's interest in educating the deaf. While these men are crucial to the development of educating the deaf community through sign languages, their aim was to use these alphabets to educate them orally. That is, until the French Sign Language Revolution. We've been talking a lot about Europe, but it is important that we look at 1690s America as well. In 1620, the Mayflower landed on our shores, and we began colonizing the New World. In the 1690s, a specific group of immigrants from Kent County, England arrived in Massachusetts. This group brought with them a unique genetic defect that caused hereditary deafness. Deafness was so prevalent that in the 19th century, around 1 in every 155 islanders were deaf. The result from this was Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. It is so important in deaf history because they were extremely independent. Deaf people on the island were not excluded. Hearing and deaf inhabitants coexisted harmoniously, and nearly everyone on the island knew their sign language. Side note, it is important to recognize that Native American Wampanoans previously occupied what is now known as Martha's Vineyard before the arrival of English settlers. Native American camps that carbon date 2270 BCE have been uncovered on the island. The English colonized Martha's Vineyard, similarly to the rest of the U.S. Abbe Charles Michel de Lepe was a French Catholic priest. He met two deaf sisters whose previous teacher had died suddenly. Lepe stepped in as their new teacher, a decision that started his lifelong mission of serving and educating the deaf population of France. In Paris, an organic sign language that had developed over centuries had already been used by the deaf population. Lepe added to this French sign language system by creating a series of hand signals to replace the sounds of the alphabet. As he taught the twins, Lepe uncovered a breakthrough in deaf education. Deaf people learn everything hearing people learn through words, just visually. He realized that this sign language was just as expressive as spoken language, and the key to educating them was teaching them to communicate with their hands rather than their voices. Around the year 1760, Lepe opened the first public school for the deaf in the world. Its name in English was the Royal Institution of Deaf Mutes. He taught deaf students through sign language, being the first to focus on this mode of communication rather than oralism. Educationalists all around the world were intrigued by this development. Italy derived its own methodology for educating the deaf directly from France's. The Emperor of Austria and the Empress of Russia both sent teachers to learn Lepe's teaching style, spreading the use of teaching the deaf through sign language. Lepe's influence and success led to 21 schools for the deaf using sign language being established in France. Deaf students came from all over Europe to attend these schools. While Lepe was developing his signed-only teaching style for deaf students, Britain and Germany were taking different approaches. In Britain, Thomas Braidwood established Britain's first school for the deaf, Braidwood's Academy for the Deaf and Dumb. This school was not as successful as Lepe's, but was influential in Britain and Scotland. Braidwood's education style combined both signed languages and the study of articulation and lip reading. The sign language he developed served as the predecessor to what is now BSL, British Sign Language. In Germany, Samuel Heineck started the first German school for the deaf in 1778. Unfortunately, Heineck was strictly an oralist. He insisted that lip reading was the best education method because deaf students needed to use the spoken language used in society. He hated the use of sign language for educating the deaf and even published a book attacking Leppe for teaching his students through sign language in 1780. His teachings established the modern concept of oralism, which will become important later. While Heineck had some influence in Germany, his effort did not halt Leppe from educating his students through sign language. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was a Yale graduate and an ordained clergyman in Hartford, Connecticut. In 1814, Gallaudet met neighbor Mason Fitch Cogswell's deaf daughter, Alice. She was 9 years old at the time, and Gallaudet noticed that she was excluded by the other children. He began teaching Alice the names of objects by drawing pictures and words in the dirt. Cogswell was impressed by Gallaudet's ability to educate his daughter and convinced him to pursue deaf education. In 1815, Cogswell aimed to send Gallaudet to Europe to study established means of deaf education. Cogswell was a wealthy man and was able to raise the money to send Gallaudet to England in just one afternoon. Gallaudet aimed to study at Thomas Braidwood's School for the Deaf in England and Scotland, but Braidwood did not welcome Gallaudet, demanding unfair compensation. Abbe Roch Ambrose Sergent Sicard, Leppe's successor at the Paris School for the Deaf, happened to be in England at the same time, giving lectures on deaf education along with two of his deaf assistants, Jean Messieu and Laurent Clerc. When Gallaudet introduced himself and explained his vision of establishing a school for the deaf in America, Sicard gladly invited him back to Paris to learn the French method of deaf education. Gallaudet studied the Leppe method of educating the deaf for a few months and was extremely impressed with what he saw. However, he was running out of money and needed to return home. Gallaudet convinced the aforementioned Laurent Clerc to venture with him so that they could set up a strong school for the deaf in America together. On the long voyage back, Gallaudet taught Clerc English, and Clerc taught Gallaudet French Sign Language. Clerc and Gallaudet opened the first American public school for the deaf on April 15, 1817, in Hartford's Bennett City Hotel. Their first class only had 9 students, including Alice Cogswell. But as word spread, young deaf students from across the country journeyed to Hartford to be taught by the famous and reputable Clerc and Gallaudet. It is important to note that the original French Sign Language used by Clerc in France is not what ended up being taught in the classroom. The language used today, American Sign Language, consists of a blend between French Sign Language, Plains Indian Sign Language, and other home signs used at the time. Again, it is important to note that Native Americans influenced the development of American Sign Language, ASL. Gallaudet himself referenced PISL, Plains Indian Sign Language, in his 1848 essay advocating for the use of sign language as the optimal mode of education for the deaf. PISL, in brief, was a form of sign language developed by Native Americans that was passed down through families. By 1863, 22 deaf schools were in operation around the U.S., most founded and run by Clerc and Gallaudet's students. Gallaudet's youngest son, Edward Minor Gallaudet, continued his father's legacy in deaf education. After teaching at the Hartford School for a number of years, Edward was instrumental in establishing the first college for the deaf in 1864, then known as the Columbia Institution for the Deaf and Dumb and Blind. This university, located in Washington, D.C., was later renamed Gallaudet University, and is the most prestigious university for the deaf known today. Edward established the use of the combined method for teaching deaf students. This method is most similar to Braidwood's, which uses both oral and signed methods to educate. However, a very important difference is that, while Braidwood did not value BSL as a primary language, Edward did, advocating that both English and ASL should be considered and taught as primary languages. Pre-1880 is often known as the Enlightened Era for deaf education across America and Europe. However, this all changed after the Milan Conference of 1880. With any new societal change comes a variety of opinions. As deaf education was on the rise in America, so was the debate on which method was actually best for educating deaf people. People who believe in oralism believe that deaf people need to communicate through the use of speech and lip reading rather than sign language. Oralism had already been happening in places such as Germany, but the want for oralism to replace sign language pedagogy was starting to blossom in 1860s America. By 1867, major schools in America began using oral methods of teaching with no sign language at all. However, sign language education was still prevalent, with Gallaudet and Clerk schools being extremely popular with deaf students and their families. Unfortunately, some oralists thought it was their right to take away the option for sign language from deaf people. One notable man, a eugenicist who made the school one of his life missions, is more commonly known as the inventor of the telephone. That's right, the villain of the deaf world is none other than Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell chose to use much of his earnings from his telephone to pursue orally educating deaf people. He believed it was essential for deaf people to learn to speak so that they could integrate into society. Both Bell's mother and wife were deaf, which would explain his passion on the subject. There is much that can be discussed and explained about Bell's family life, so if you're interested, comment down below. Bell even opened an oral school for the deaf himself in 1872. However, what is most important for this video is his influence in the Milan Conference. The Milan Conference of 1880 was the first international conference of deaf educators held, of course, in Milan, Italy. Alexander Graham Bell was one of the men in attendance, and he advocated strongly against the use of sign language in the slightest. Over half of the committee were supporters of oralism, so after only 5 days of deliberations from September 6th to 11th, the conference declared that oralism was superior to signed education, and passed a resolution banning the use of sign language in school. This impacted countries across Europe, and of course America. Even simultaneous communication, which is the act of speaking and signing at the same time, was banned in fear of, quote, injuring articulation and lip reading and the precision of ideas. Even though this decree was technically non-binding, many deaf teachers and just deaf people in other career fields lost their jobs. The most notable school that ignored this decree was the aforementioned Gallaudet University. They held on to their combined method of teaching, which was crucial to the preservation of ASL. There were other instances of resistance to this decree in America, most notably the establishment of the National Association of the Deaf. However, oralism was now the dominant method of educating deaf students throughout America and Europe. This ban on sign language impacted many deaf communities globally for as long as it was in effect, and is a very dark stain in deaf history. In Europe, sign language was banned in the classroom until around the 1980s, making this ban last 100 years. In America, sign language was not forbidden as long, but still for 80 years. It was only allowed to be used again in the classroom after researcher William Stokey proved that ASL was a true, bona fide language that conveys complex thoughts and ideas. The effects of the Milan Conference on the deaf community are still felt around the world, and oftentimes people in the community wonder what life would be like had it not happened. Perhaps more people would be bilingual. Perhaps ostracization would not be such a common part of the deaf experience. Perhaps society at large would even know the basics surrounding deaf history, deaf culture, or even just sign language. There are many hypotheticals that could have taken place, but that is just unfortunately not what happened in history. The only thing we can do is improve the education and treatment of deaf individuals now. The first thing that we hearing people need to do in order to help the deaf community, myself included, is spread awareness. I hope this video taught you something new. The history of deaf education alone is an untapped world of interest. This video only slightly touched on the concept of autism, which is a word and concept most of you watching are probably unfamiliar with. If you would like me to make a video discussing autism or other aspects of deaf history in depth, be sure to leave a comment below. See you on the next episode of Little Known History.